Today is Monday, November 4th, and we're having Colonel Jacques Baud with us to talk about what's going on in the Middle East. Welcome back, Colonel.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me back to your show. Thanks.
My pleasure. And let's start with what's going on right now between Iran and Israel. Right now, it seems Iran wants to attack Israel to respond to what Israel did. Do you find this as something that is about to escalate? Because right now, if they attack each other, it maybe gets out of the hand in the Middle East. With the situation that we're having right now in Lebanon and in Gaza, and what's going on right now between Iran and Israel, how do you find it? Do you think that Israel is capable of sustaining the conflict in the southern part of Lebanon at the same time attacking Iran and having this sort of conflict, this sort of escalations with Iran?
Well, I think, first of all, that Israel has definitely lost this, I would say, all out war because it has lost in Gaza, it is losing in Lebanon, it has not been able to silence the Houthis. It has not been able to get a hold on the West Bank. So, and on the international stage, I think everybody understands that Israel is a country that will doesn't didn't doesn't and will not respect the law, the international law, and therefore Israel is on the way to be a kind of a pariah state. And so, on that point, I think this has to be clear. Now, the question of Iran is a good question because personally, I would have expected that Iran would have seized the last or the result of the last Israeli attack as a starting point to say, well, now we can discuss. Because obviously, the Israeli attack was a failure. I think I mean, we don't know exactly what happened and what the exact results are, but everything we have so far indicates that Israel failed in its attack. It was not able to penetrate significantly the Iranian air defense. It was not able to attack the significant objectives in Iran. And there were probably some minor attacks and probably minor successes. It's probably worth noting that after the Israeli attack on Israel, we had several reports coming up afterwards with
Iranian attack on Israel, you mean?
the Iranian attack on Israel. Sorry. And we had all sorts of satellite imagery and videos and things like that that would show that Iran had a success in Israel. Nothing comes in that sense. We have a camp of video coming out of Iran, which basically indicates or suggests that Israel aircraft or missiles were intercepted in the air. And there is no real satellite imagery that shows, I mean, significant success of Israel. And there are those several reports, and I think I discussed that already on your channel. That we had, in fact, Israel had to abort its operation because it noticed that it was not able to penetrate Iranian defense. So basically, it's a failure, and we could have used that as an argument to say, okay, you have lost, but if you agree to have some kind of let's say peace agreement or so, then we leave it as it is, and that's it. And I would have expected something like that. The problem is, and I think if we listen at the comments and the speeches of Ali Khamenei and also the head of the Iranian Revolution Guards. I think it's Hussein Salameh. I may be wrong, but I think it's him.
Yeah, Hossein Salami. Yeah.
Hussein Salameh, exactly. And when we listen to these guys, we see that the problem is a little bit broader than simply a bilateral argument between Israel and Iran. Iran has now assumed the responsibility for engaging to, I would say, in respect to the principle of the responsibility to protect, Iran is assuming the responsibility of siding with the Palestinians on one hand and the South Lebanese on the other hand. And therefore, it has given itself another task than simply the bilateral issue between Israel and itself. So we that's probably the reason why when we listen to the rhetoric that has emerged after the Israeli attack, we might be surprised. But in fact, it's probably consistent with this idea that Iran, because it was attacked, its consulate in Damascus was attacked, because Ismail Haniyeh was attacked, Iran feels itself now entitled to something else than just defending itself. And that's probably what Israel has achieved by attacking Iran. That was the aim of having Iran involved in the conflict, and that for that reason, Israel started to attack Iran, and now it has it. It has the additional front it didn't want to have. When Netanyahu says that Israel is attacked on 7 fronts, of course, he failed to mention that Israel created all these fronts, you know, and and now Israel has to live with those 7 fronts, and I think Iran has adopted this logic and say, okay, you wanted this, now you have it. And that's an interesting approach, because so far, to be honest, before the different speeches of Ali Khamenei, I intuitively understood the Iranian reaction as a bilateral thing. But in fact, it's more than this. It's much more than this. We are now in something which is almost multilateral, if you want. Iran assuming the part of the defense for the Lebanese and the Palestinians. And I think, that's where we see that Israel has absolutely no, let's say, sound strategy to address the whole issue. And all probably accept the fact that the aim of all that for Israel is to drag the US into a regional conflict. That's probably the only thing that may explain this policy of enlarging the conflicts, because it didn't achieve any success to Gaza, then it attacked in the north and things like that. So we have with Israel, as I said many times, the problem is that its national security is not based on the stability of its strategic context, but it's based on its aggressiveness and the fear it inspires to its neighbors. And that's, I think, the problem. We have here, today it's Netanyahu, but I think in essence, this is a strategy that Israel has since the early 50s, 1950s, I mean. And we see now the limits of this strategy. That was valid, or let's say that worked, as long as we were in the Cold War, as long as the US had this the small advanced position in the Middle East, Israel being this advanced position, and it was surrounded by more or less Arab states that were allied to the Soviet Union, and we had this kind of relationship. But and since the end of the Cold War, we never had a really confrontation. I mean, they were between Palestinians and Israel, with Hezbollah and Israel, but not. It was not really. It didn't reach a multinational dimension, if you want. Today is at reach. It has reached this dimension, because everybody has understood that regardless of the context, regardless of who the neighbors are, even those who are, let's say, who could be potential, probably not allied, but let's say partners like Saudi Arabia and things like this, despite all this, Israel is still sticks to this aggressive national security strategy. As a result, now everybody understands that Israel is a problem, and therefore we have even probably in countries such as Egypt and Jordan, which are still very much in line, or let's say, I mean, the governments are in line with the US and with the Western world. I'm not sure the populations are. And we see more and more, especially when we see Syria, in Syria, when we see that in Iraq, that you have individual armored groups who definitely side with the Palestinians and with the South Lebanese. So this is a change in the situation, and I think Israel failed to understand this change in the geography, in the geostrategic context, and that is both. Um, uh, this explains the reaction of Iran, but this also is a potential danger, because as we see in Ukraine, we see that more and more the leadership of Israel and the leadership of Ukraine both uh, tends to try to escalate the conflict somehow. And Iran knows that if Israel was not able to achieve its objective this time, it will not prevent Israel to strike again. That's probably the reason why Iran said, now we have to act and do something. That's probably, or probably in the rhetoric at least. So I don't know exactly how far they want to push it, but the rhetoric is clear. It's said, well, for us, the Israeli response is one thing, but we will respond to that, and that will reach higher levels. And that's also logic, because I think, as I said many times, in fact, the exchanges we had both in April, I mean, from an Iranian point of view, the True Promise won on the 13th of April, and True Promise 2 were in fact deterrent moves. The idea was not to inflict a strong and, let's say, severe damage to Israel, but to show they were able to respond, and to show they would be willing to respond. And they raised each time a little bit the level. That requires fine tuning, because with Israel, you go very fast to a maximal or maximalist type of answer. Therefore, Iran had to be very careful, and they managed these two the true promise one and two very, let's say, wisely, in the sense that they send the right amount of missiles, or they brought about the right amount of distraction without trespassing a limit that would trigger something wider. So it was very, very wide. The problem is that it was designed as deterrent response, and Israel is again, uh, Israel is not afraid to escalate the whole thing, because it still thinks that the Americans eventually will go and rescue the country if it goes in a serious war. And despite all what the Americans can say, Israel is confident that eventually the US might or will uh, um, engage on in the Middle East, if it's for the save to save the mere existence of Israel. And that's probably the reason why Israel has less limits than Iran. And that explains probably the reason why Iran needs to have a very strong rhetoric, and might be pushed to something more significant that it has done before, just for the sake of indicating that this deterrence cycle, or let's say this bilateral escalation, is not ended, and it can still strike. And I, I don't expect the Iran to strike, for instance, large cities or civilian objectives, but I could imagine that Iran could have a single strike, let's say, on Netanyahu's house, for instance, or something like that. You see, something which is not intense in the number of missiles, but intense in the political effect of this strike. And it might be very limited in scope, in the number of missiles, but with very broad and very deep effect on the Israeli society and things like that. So that's my take of this on this rhetoric that we have heard in the last couple of days.
One of the things that the president of Iran, Masoud Pezeshkian, was talking about yesterday, he said that if we go after some sort of ceasefire, some sort of negotiations for Gazans, which is much more important in the eyes of Iran right now, it seems that they see the escalation between Iran and Israel as a huge part of what's going on in Gaza. And if they can achieve something in Gaza, in the southern part of Lebanon, they may reconsider their attack on Israel. Here comes the question. It doesn't seem that, as you mentioned, the Netanyahu administration has created all of these conflicts in that region. They're not interested in any sort of ceasefire, in any sort of negotiations. But how about on the part of the United States? Are they really interested? We know that right now both parties, Republican and Democratic parties, are just competing on who's in favor of Israel the most. But at the end of the day, we know that the United States doesn't benefit with what's going on in the Middle East, considering Israel just fighting each and every country in that region. Do you think that the policymakers in the United States are thinking the same way that Netanyahu feels right now?
Well, I'm not sure that the US policy towards Israel is based on some kind of a rational calculus. I think it's the result of all the pressures that you have within the U.S. Society and the U.S. establishment, um, to support Israel, regardless of how rational it or irrational it can be. And this is something we have also to understand. I mean, we this irrationality of the support of Israel. I mean, it it may not be irrational to support Israel, but the nature of the support may not always be rational in the sense that it's rational to support a country, a friendly country, but uh, the rationale. Remember Steve Bannon, and the same applies to Joe Biden, by the way. They define themselves as Christian Zionists, you know, meaning that there is something that goes beyond geopolitics. There is something that goes beyond the rational understanding of how countries should behave with each other. It's there is something almost mystical behind all this, and that applies to both Republican. Steve Bannon was he was the national security advisor for a while of or one of the security advisor of Donald Trump, and there are probably others, by the way, and Joe Biden, who is a Democrat. So meaning that we have it's very much bipartisan approach, and this bipartisan approach is based on kind of an irrational approach to the support of Israel. Again, I have, in essence, no support if you have no how to say that no objection if anyone decide that Israel is our friend and will support it because it's our friend. But when you start to support because of religious ideas or something religious, then there is something a different dimension that that indicates that people might be ready for something irrational, and when we look at the balance of forces in the Middle East, we can assume that if all Arab countries would unite against Israel, then Israel would probably be in a disadvantage. And that, in a logical or rational context, that would prompt Israel to have a more, let's say, cooperative approach with its neighbors, and a more cooperative approach also domestically with the Palestinians. And that would have ideally uh, supported the idea that Israel should have solved this problem with the Palestinians already decades ago. But as we see today, we see that the whole thing is not rational at all. And when you hear, and if you remember the speech of Benjamin Netanyahu in front of the Congress a few months ago, when he explained the situation of Israel, he didn't come with the UN resolution, resolution 181 or something like that. No, he came to the Bible. The Bible is a rationale. And therefore, we see that there is something that goes beyond the a rational approach to the foreign policy and national security policy of Israel and the US, by the way. And that is dangerous because that means that basically these guys behave in the same way as the Islamic State. You see, this is the same kind of thing. Then gods decide for you to some extent. So that means that the conflict may have no limit. And if you destroy the whole region with a nuclear bomb, well, this is the way it should be. Um, um, and that's, I think, is the dangerous aspect of this conflict, and the dangerous aspect of the support of the US towards Israel, we would have, I think, a more, let's say, a healthy approach if we would approach the conflict from a rational point of view, saying, okay, guys, regardless of how you feel about Palestinians, they are there. And regardless of how you feel about the relationship with them, you are bound to the UN resolutions, and you have, and we should enforce not the supremacy of Israel, but to enforce the UN resolutions. That that should be, in my view, the right approach to this conflict. And regardless of how Israel feels, this should be the baseline, because today we have, since nobody wants to apply the international law, including the UN resolution, then where are we? What is the baseline? What is the reference point? Where do we stop? And that's the dangerous aspect of this conflict. And unfortunately, in the US, I don't see in the political establishment, but guys, because I think that if you look at the military establishment, Pentagon and all that, people have a more rational understanding of the whole thing. But that's also the nature of military, to be more rational, to be uh, bound to the realities of the ground, and not you're not in the clouds, you are on the ground when you do war. And that's probably the reason why the military establishment is probably more realistic. But in the political establishment, there is an irrationality that is, for me, extremely dangerous. And all that, by the way, might be, I know there is a discussion within the US on the way the president can use the war powers and things like this, because um, obviously the limits that exist in the US Constitution should be safeguarded, because that would prevent the use of the US military for purposes that are beyond rationale, precisely. And that's my personal view. But I know that there is some discussion within the US about the whole issue of how the president, because he is the supreme commander of the armed forces, and it has, I mean, I don't want to enter the details here, and probably are probably more expert on that, but there are different ways the use of military force by the president outside congressional decisions is something that could be used in some, under some circumstances, in the Middle East. And I'm in my view, this is the kind of thing that needs to be questioned, because again, if we are entering a conflict that goes beyond rationale, then this is a dangerous path, in my view.
Yeah. When you look at the southern part of Lebanon right now, it seems Israel is using the same type of strategy as they've used in Gaza, just destroying the infrastructure, destroying everything that is there, hospitals, and but they're not facing Hamas. Hezbollah is totally different, and the way that they're capable of fighting back the Israeli attack. Do you think that they're still thinking that what they've done in Gaza is possible to do it again in southern part of Lebanon, with the way that in Lebanon, because on the other hand, we are witnessing that the United States is trying to do something with the government of Lebanon to isolate Hezbollah. They're fighting Hezbollah in the southern part of Lebanon. On the other hand, they're putting some sort of pressure on Lebanese government to isolate Hezbollah. But at the end of the day, they have to win on the battleground. It's not possible to defeat Hezbollah without winning on the ground. Do you think that they're still thinking that with this attitude that they have been doing in Gaza for more than a year, just destroying everything, is that possible to do again, to do it again in the southern part of Lebanon?
Well, I think the Israeli are not able to learn because what they're doing in Gaza is exactly what they have done in 2006 in South Lebanon, in fact, where they were defeated. And they were defeated by a Hezbollah that had already at that time, that's about 20 years ago now, um, Hezbollah had already a network of tunnels and trenches and bunkers and fortified places and things like this. And Israel tried to destroy everything. They were surprised by the level of sophistication of the Hezbollah in 2006. And then in fact, the Hamas copied the Hezbollah strategy for Gaza. What we have seen in Gaza is, in essence, a duplication of what happened in the South Lebanon in 2006. And now the Israelis are back in Lebanon with exactly the same adversary, with the same in the same context, and they apply exactly the same strategy that didn't work in 2006. I mean, and in essence, is a strategy based on the total destruction of your enemy. And this is what strikes me with Israel. It is this inability to adjust to the condition, to apply the same pattern of attack, destruction of everything, uh, and then hoping that you achieve victory by just destroying everybody. The but this can be explained in different ways. I mean, first of all, the Israelis as a culture, and we have seen that especially regarding Gaza, but that applies to others as well. They feel that they are superior to the others, meaning that they will prevail because of the superiority of the technology, their moral, intellectual superiority, and their material equipment superiority. And therefore, this is no for them no reason to change. The problem is that the Israel's adversaries, namely the Palestinians, not just the Hamas, but the Palestinians, and the Hezbollah in the north, they have understood. They know, in fact, the Israeli better than the Israeli knows them. I think that's the and we are exactly in the situation that was described by Sun Tzu, in a situation where you have all the reason to lose, because if you don't know yourself, you don't know what your capabilities are, and that's exactly what we have seen in in Gaza and now in South Lebanon, that the Israeli have overestimated their own capabilities towards the. So they tend to underestimate their enemy and to overestimate their own capabilities, and that's exactly the combination that brings defeat. And so there is no mystery on that. Now, the reason why, a second aspect that may explain the reason why Israel tends to wage war by destroying completely its enemy, is that there is still this idea that the Israel should, at the end of the day, should have the whole region. You know, the Lebanon is part, according to the Israeli, or let's say the Jewish theology, um, the south, the Lebanon belongs to this great Israel, as does Syria, as does the western part of Iraq, as does the part of Egypt up to the Nile River. So there is this idea that this territory belongs to us. So we are habilitated, or we are entitled to destroy everything that occupies our territory. And by the way, this idea that this ownership of Israel over the South Lebanon. This was pointed out by, I think it was the Jerusalem Post that had recently an article about this. So, meaning that it's not just, we're not just talking about something which is just philosophical. It is something which is very much entrenched in the ideas, especially of the current leadership of Israel, which is very strongly influenced by the religious interpretation of the geography. So we have this aspect that explains that Israel is basically, now or later, it will or will strive to destroy the other populations that are on its own territory, or what it considers as its own territory. Now, when it comes to the question of US, Hezbollah, and the Lebanese government, we have seen recently, and it's interesting because I think it was less so obvious in the previous interventions of Israel. I mean, there is also a good reason. So because Resolution 1701, that is very strongly referred to today, didn't exist in 2006 because it was done after the conflict. So, but we didn't mention this resolution, and I think nobody understands its resolution as it should be understood. If you read Resolution 1701, it asks for the reestablishment of the Lebanese authority on the whole of Lebanese territory, and and also for the disbandment of all armed groups. That includes, in theory, the Hezbollah. But there is an interesting aspect that nobody mentions. But the Resolution 1701 is in fact based on another agreement that was signed in 1989 by the Lebanese factions, the different factions of Lebanon, which is the Taif Agreement. And the Taif Agreement was an agreement that, in fact, it was the agreement that was supposed to put an end at all the domestic conflict that you had in Lebanon during the 70s and early 80s. And one aspect of this Taif agreement is also the disbandment of all armed groups, but and also to restore the sovereignty of the whole Lebanon through the development of the Lebanese armed forces. Now, one aspect of the Taif agreement is that all armed groups should be disbanded once the country has been, or once the Israeli forces have left the country. And that's the key point. That Israel, in fact, still occupies part of the Lebanese territory. And for that reason, the Hezbollah has always said they agree with the Taif agreement, but we have to acknowledge that the Israelis have not left the whole territory, and therefore not all armed militias should be disbanded as long as the Israeli have not left totally the country. And that's the rationale for the Hezbollah to stay. And therefore, that's the rationale for the Hezbollah to say we agree with the resolution 1701, but first, Israel must leave the country. And I have mentioned a couple of times on your program that because of Israel is still occupying the, notably in particular, the Sheba farm uh, uh, spot, which is in the northern part of the Golan Heights, and which is in theory, I mean, which is a Lebanese territory. In fact, it used to be a Syrian territory, but it was given by Syria to the Lebanon, and the Lebanese territory comprises these Sheba farms. And now the Lebanese government says that the Lebanon should retrieve its border of 1949, which obviously include the Sheba Farms area, including some other places that Israel has annexed along the Lebanese border. So we are here in a situation where, in fact, the UN has never been able to enforce the reestablishment of the Lebanese border as it was in 1949. And the Lebanese forces, I mean, the Lebanese army, has never been in a position to reinstate its sovereignty or its authority on all the Lebanese territory, because Hezbollah is in fact stronger, probably stronger than the Lebanese army, in fact. So we're in a situation where, because the international community has not been able to enforce the the resolution that asked Israel to leave Lebanon, we are still in a situation that Israel has created. And Israel has created the situation that is at the basis of the creation of Hezbollah, and is at the basis of the mere existence of Hezbollah. So we are the snake bites its tail, if you want. We are moving in circle, and but we are still always in the same uh, problem, that because Israel doesn't respect the international law, it is now in problems it cannot solve by itself, and that will be more and more the case. It's not the case with the Palestinians. It's not the case with Syria, because again, Golan Heights do not belong to Israel, even if Israel has annexed it. East Jerusalem does not belong to Israel, even if Israel has annexed it. As the International Court of Justice just stated again, the occupied territories are not Israeli, and Israeli should leave them. And the international community has been asked by the International Court of Justice to enforce, or to make Israel to abide by these international resolutions, and the international community doesn't want to do that. So we create a situation in which Israel will find itself in a perpetual war, because it will never accept the authority of the UN. And we are back to the same problem from the very beginning of this conflict in 1947, that Israel, and I said even before it existed, because Israel existed since the 14th of May 1948, but even before that, the Jews and then the Israelis never applied the international law, never applied the UN resolution afterwards, and even didn't apply or didn't even comply with their own promises. Because I remind you that in order to be accepted in the United Nations in 1949, Israel had to declare that it would respect the right of return for the Palestinians, and it would respect the authority, the international status of East Jerusalem. And it has never complied with its own word. So we are in a situation that as long as the Israeli do not realize that they behave outside of the international law, and that's precisely by the way, if I open a bracket here, that's the reason why Netanyahu never mentioned the international law but prefers to refer to the Bible, because Israel will never comply with international law. It has never, and it will never. So we are here with a problem that can be solved just by force, in fact. And that's where the international community has, in my view, a very strong responsibility, because we know that, we observe that since 75 years, but we don't want to act on this. And that's the reason why in my book on these Al-Aqsa flood, the very first sentence of my book is that if we are not taking care of that, Israel will disappear. Because at the end, if the West cannot press or make enough pressure on Israel so that it complies with international law, we may have other countries of the region. And probably what we are hearing now from Iran is probably the first step of that, that the countries of the region will say stop now, because we have seen almost 80 years of problems, violence, war, just because Israel doesn't want to accept the ruling of the United Nations. So there is a point where patience has limits, and probably we may face a situation where more countries decide to say that's Israel is the problem, then we have to remove the problem. And that's a serious risk. And that's why I don't understand the behavior of countries such as Germany, such as even United States. Even United States probably a little bit different because of the domestic pressure. I mean, in essence, I don't understand why they don't promote the international law. So that's understand me well, but I understand also that they are they are the same people that you have in Israel are also influencing the politics in the US. So you cannot expect from them kind of rational approach, but you can expect a rational approach from outsiders, and European Union or European countries at large have this position to be outsiders and could in fact play a moderating role or a mediating role in this conflict. The problem is that nobody wants to listen to them, and they are not strong enough, they are not credible enough to raise their voice. We see that in the whole conflict, especially when we talk about these exchanges between Israel and Iran, we talk about possible, let's say, influence of the US, but nobody talks about the European Union. European Union is totally absent from the whole discussion because it is not credible, and that, I think, is a little bit, it's a pity because, as I said, the US is too much connected or too strongly connected to Israel in order to have this kind of rational approach. Europe could, but is not able to do it. So this is a very strange situation, and I don't know how this will evolve, but this might be the last. I mean, some have predicted that this would lead to the disparition of Israel. I'm not able to say that. I don't have any crystal ball. But if Israel continues to behave that way, that's probably the way it will go, unfortunately. I don't hear you.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me right now?
Yes, yes, perfect.
Yeah. Just to wrap up this session, yesterday we learned that 52 countries demand an arms embargo against Israel. When you look at the countries, the name China, Russia, Vietnam, Mexico, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, Indonesia, Egypt, Iran, even Turkey, when you see how things are changing in favor of the resistance, not in favor of Israel, and do you think that with the pressure that we're witnessing, with this understanding, global understanding, what's going on in the mind of the countries in the region, together with China, Russia, these superpowers, because we know that the United States is not capable of convincing these superpowers to change their mind because they're having a conflict with Russia, a direct conflict in Ukraine, and they're having a conflict with China. And so they cannot negotiate on what's going on in the Middle East. It's so difficult. But at the end
Well,
of the day, when you look at the picture, the whole picture, what's going on in the Middle East, these Arab states together with Iran, Turkey, and what's coming from Russia and China, even Vietnam, Mexico, even here is in South America, most of the countries are in favor of the people in Gaza. How do you see the pressure going to the Netanyahu administration?
well, we have, obviously there is something changing, but at the same time we have to be careful because all the countries you have mentioned who ask for an arms embargo towards Israel are precisely those countries that do not deliver weapons or supply weapons to Israel. This would have some weight if countries like France, UK, Germany, or Italy would be part of this kind of declaration. But it's not the case. So those who provide weapons to Israel have not changed their mind. And the other countries, when we talk about the BRICS and all that, we are talking about uh, a group of countries that have other focus. When we had this summit in Kazan, and we see that the focus of the BRICS is not like supremacy and use of force and this kind of thing. On the contrary, uh, China is a big power, but has no history of using force to enforce a policy or to enforce a behavior. The same applied to the other countries that you mentioned. Take Saudi Arabia, for instance. Yes, it sides with Iran because they want peace in the region. And obviously, as Iran, the Saudis have understood that destabilization of the region cannot bring anything positive to anybody. regardless of whether you are Sunni or Shia. So they are for the common sense, but they don't have an history of imposing their will to others through force. Those who have this history are the Westerners, are the Europeans. And these are precisely those countries that are ready to supply weapons, to intervene militarily, to impose sanctions, and all that. So, if I could put it very, let's say, to simplify a little bit, I would say the BRICS and this new organization of the world is more a defensive organization than an offensive one. And that's probably to be better able to respond to the aggressiveness of the West. And if you look at all the measures that have been suggested during the Kazan meeting, you can see those are defensive measures. These are not offensive. They are not planning to de-dollarize in the sense that they would suppress the dollar and all that. They don't want to impose their will to others. And no, and this is perfectly stated in the final communique, by the way, that they want to be complementary. They just want to protect themselves from the reach of the Western countries, and they organize themselves for that, and therefore, of course, they understand perfectly well that in the Middle East the problem is Israel, and not necessarily Israel as an entity, but Israel as an entity that behave not properly. So it's not the existence which is the problem, although we could discuss that, but this is not, in essence, it's not the existence, but the way it behaves. And and that's part of the this breaks or rest of the world approach to problems. They don't want to interfere or to impose their will through force, but they want to protect themselves from the action of the West. And that's explained probably this the different behavior, but that also explain why nobody is able, or let's say is willing, to go at war against Israel. Now, the problem is, of course, Iran, because Iran was attacked first. And therefore, Iran is not entitled to have this kind of response against Israel. But beyond this, if Israel hadn't attacked or performed a terrorist attack on Iranian soil, I think Iran would not do anything. They are not very much concerned about Israel. But since Israel has declared that Iran is its enemy, then Iran takes it as it is, and they then side with the Palestinians because it's right to do so, because the Palestinians are in the right according to international law, and therefore Iran can side with the Palestinians because they are on the right side of the international law, if you want. But beyond that, Iran has no interest in fighting Israel. They don't have border problem, territory problem, and things like this. So there is no real reason for Iran to be enemy to Israel outside the fact that Israel considers everybody as enemy, and therefore everybody starts to behave like an enemy. So we are in this situation. Now, the problem is that I have pointed out this problem since a couple of show now. It's the fact that the West seems to lose its ability to pressure Israel. And that's, I think, and we have the same thing with Ukraine, by the way, that because these countries feel to be cornered, they tend to behave erratically, and they tend to behave irrationally, and therefore outside of any advice from the country. On the other hand, we have a region or countries like the Europe or European countries who tend to have abandoned the old traditional diplomatic way of solving problems. Now, the West tends to see the world in black and white. And when I say black and white, it's black and white. That means without all the shades of gray. And so you are either with them or against them. And that's a little bit how Europe sees the Ukrainian conflict and the Israeli conflict. As a result, even if Europe wanted to have some kind of influence in the conflict, they couldn't, because they declared Iran as enemy. They declared the Palestinians are terrorists as terrorists. Hezbollah is a terrorist. Hamas is a terrorist, and therefore you cannot talk to them. And that's the trap of having or designating terrorists or people as terrorists everywhere, because then you cannot talk to them. And that's the reason why Israel is prompting its allies to designate Palestinians and Hezbollah and so on as terrorists, because so there is no, Israel doesn't want to negotiate. It will not negotiate, and I think all the ideas that we have on negotiating Israel is wrong. Israel has never, I mean, when it has negotiated, it has never respected what was negotiated or what was agreed upon. It has always avoided negotiations. We have seen that with the Palestinians since last October, but that goes much beyond that, because on the status of Gaza and all that, there has never been any negotiation. And they are even blocking the UNRWA for being on the Palestinian soil, which is quite odd. But the thing is that they are able to do that because Palestine is not recognized as a state. If we could recognize Palestine as a state, then we could have UNRWA on. I mean, Israel should not have anything to say about it, but they still consider Gaza and other parts of the occupied territory as part of Israel. And that shows that Israel has absolutely no willingness to negotiate. And the West, probably the European more than the Americans, the Europeans are exactly in the same mood. They don't want to negotiate, and they are not able to negotiate because they don't have the legal tools to be able, or political tools to negotiate, because they designate everybody as terrorists, and therefore you don't talk to terrorists, and that's it. So you are bound to have war.
Unfortunately.
Yes, unfortunately, this is dramatic because it is a departure from everything we had up to, let's say, 20 years ago, where the Europeans had some kind of, I mean, individual countries, because Europe as an entity, a European Union as an entity, since it has no common foreign policy, it cannot have a diplomacy that reflects the interest of the whole community, if you want, because there is no common policy. I mean, the interest of Estonia are exactly not exactly the same as the interest of Portugal, as an example. And therefore, European it's very hard for the European Union to have a consistent foreign policy. Individual countries could have that. Let's say France, for instance, or Germany, or UK. I mean, UK is not in the EU, but let's say France, Germany. But the problem is that those countries are not credible. because they don't behave in a credible manner. I mean, Macron says everything and its opposite, and the same from Germany. You hear everything and its opposite from the government. So, how can you trust such governments? And therefore, these countries who could have some diplomatic weight and could have they have, or they used to have, a diplomatic apparatus that would allow such discussion. They don't have it anymore, and we see that in the Ukrainian conflict. And the European diplomacy is totally absent, both at European Union level and at individual country level, with probably the exception of Hungary, which is probably the only country that still has, let's say, a relevant diplomacy in
Some
the.
sort of sovereignty.
Sorry.
It's some sort of sovereignty they have. They're experiencing.
This is the problem, and we are exactly in that. And in both in Ukraine and in Palestine, we have the same problem. Nobody talks to anybody, and there is no place for mediation. There is no place for a mediator that would help the parties to the conflict to come together and talk to the same table. And it's tragic in a sense. The US used to do that in the 80s, early 90s, in the 70s also with Jimmy Carter. So that's when in fact the US gained its, let's say, legitimacy in the region. But today, US has lost that. It is a party to conflict. It's no longer this superpower that can have some, let's say, distance with conflicts and help solving problems. It's part of US has become part of the problem, and that's where we are.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Colonel, for being with us today. Great pleasure
My
as
pleasure.
always.
Thank you very much. Thank you.